The Bunjee Venture by Stan Murtry, and we're on to chapter 11. If you remember, Karen and Andy had been swept into an underground cavern, and there was stinging jelly on the walls of the cavern, and it was attracted to sound. And they'd almost been killed, stung alive, but they'd climbed up stalagmites and stalactites, and just as they thought they were going to be killed, they were aiming towards a circle of light in the roof, and a hand had grabbed them from the hole and dragged them out of the hole. And it was their dad, and he was the one they'd been looking for. Chapter 11. Well, 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 what an incredible story. Mr. Winsborough wiped a little more of his homemade ointment onto the burn on his son's neck. He patted his daughter affectionately on the knee and sat back on the ground near the fire. The two children snuggled up to their father and gazed into the flames happily. 6 hours had passed since their father had snatched them out of the cavern and away from the dreadful jelly. They'd been so weak from fright and exhaustion that he'd carried them across the sandy plain and up the hill to his cave. There he dressed their grazed elbows and knees, built up a large fire to warm them, and fed them from a store of fruit that he had at the back of the cave. He'd insisted that they should not talk until they were fully rested and warm, but inevitably the questions tumbled out, and anyway, they were far too excited to rest. They'd found their father. It had all been worth it after all. It seemed unbelievable that they could have escaped from all the horrors of the past few hours. Death had seemed so close at times, but now they had accomplished what they'd set out to achieve. They had found him. Now all that remained to do was to get home somehow. Karen gave her father another squeeze. "But how did you find us?" she asked. He smiled down at them. "It were just a fantastic bit of luck," he said. "Ever since I arrived at this place, it's been my habit to walk across to the forest once a day to collect fruit. I was on my way back today when I heard you screaming and yelling down in the cavern. At first, I thought it was some kind of prehistoric animal making the noise, but I looked down the hole and I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw you two down there." "But why didn't you shout to let us know you were there?" said Andy. "I did," replied Mr. Winsborough, "but you were making such a racket you didn't hear me. When you ducked under the water, I rushed back to the forest to cut a vine. I thought I'd lower it down to you and pull you out, but when I got back, of course, you were both at the top of the pillar. I yelled and shouted, but that jelly stuff was making such a din that you still couldn't hear me. Luckily, you stuck your hand out and I were able to haul you up." He hugged them both, again for the 100th time in the last hour, and carried on. "You know, when you first appeared and the pterodactyl carried you off, I was so sure that you would be eaten. It was terrible. There was nothing I could do to help you. And now, here you are, alive and well. You've been so very brave, enduring all that you've done, and so very clever getting here in the first place." "But what about you, Daddy?" said Karen. She leant over and put another branch on the fire. "Have you been in any danger at all?" Mr. Winsborough scratched his head. "Well, I've had nothing like what you've had to go through. A Tyrannosaurus had a peek in my cave one night, and I've been chased by a couple of pterodactyls on my way to him from the forest, but nothing worth mentioning after your tales." He paused for a moment and then said, "Strangely enough, I was attacked several times today by a sinister creature. Unfortunately, I didn't have the fire going at the time. The wild creatures round here are terribly frightened of fire. But today I didn't light it. I was sitting down on a rock eating my lunch when this horrible creature attacked from the air and managed to scramble out of its way, and was able to drive it away by throwing stones at it. But it's tried again and again to get close to the cave. I only hope the fire will keep it at bay from now on." Andy shuddered. "Can't we make a run for the forest now? Let's just find the time machine now and go home. I'm sick of strange creatures attacking us. I want to see Mum." Mr. Winsborough smiled. "We all want to see your mother," he said, "but look outside. It's dark. There are all kinds of fierce animals prowling about at night. Be patient and wait till morning." I suppose you're right, said Andy. Suddenly, he felt terribly tired. He looked across at Karen. Her eyes were drooping too. I think I'm going to go to sleep now, he said. He lay down beside the fire and closed his eyes. Karen needed no second bidding. She lay down beside her brother and cradled her head in her arms. "Night, kids," said Mr. Winsborough. He leant over and kissed them both. "And thank you so much for having the courage to come and rescue me. I'm very proud of you both." "Good night, Dad," they said. Mr. Winsborough stood up and he looked down on his two sleepy children. He smiled happily and he walked across to the pile of logs at the entrance to the cave. He started walking back and forward, carrying logs and building up the fire for the night. Suddenly, at the entrance to the cave, he stiffened and stood staring out into the darkness. There was a faint clatter of rocks. Quietly, Mr. Winsborough walked back into the cave. He bent down beside the two sleeping children and shook them gently awake. They looked at him uncomprehendingly. Karen opened her mouth to speak. Mr. Winsborough put his finger to his lips. He whispered, "Make any noise. The creature I told you about, it's outside again and he's coming straight towards the cave. Pick up a few rocks and we'll try to get rid of it." Silently, the children got to their feet. They armed themselves with stones, then flattened themselves against the walls of the cave. The blackness outside was intense. The silence was absolutely total. Karen could feel her heart thudding in her chest. Both children were wide awake and alert now. The new danger prickled their skin and sharpened their senses. Outside, there was another clatter of stones. "The creature must be making its way over the small band of shingle that lies at the bottom of Flat Rock," Andy whispered into his... Oh, sorry, that should be Andy's voice. Outside, the clatter of stones. "The creature must be making its way over the small band of shingle that lies at the bottom of the Flat Rock," Andy whispered into his father's ear. Mr. Winsborough nodded, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance. There was another long silence then, quite clearly. The three in the cave heard a kind of slurping noise, as though the creature was licking something. Then another silence. Then a voice said, "Hello, is there anybody in there?" "Bunjee!" yelled the children. Mr. Winsborough was almost bowled over as the children rushed past him and out of the cave entrance. He stood with a look of absolute astonishment on his face as they came back, hugging and kissing a huge, hairy, elephant-like creature. "Daddy," they said in unison, "this is Bunjee." Bunjee took a couple of steps backwards when he saw Mr. Winsborough. He pointed at him accusingly with the tip of his trunk. "He threw stones at my head," he said. "Oh, he didn't mean to," said Andy. He thought you were an enemy. He's never seen a Bunjee before." "I never seen him before," said Bunjee, "but I didn't throw stones at his head." Daddy, if it hadn't been for Bunjee, we'd both be dead by now," Karen said. He saved our lives." Mr. Winsborough held out his hand and took a tentative step forward. I'm sorry," he said. I didn't know." Karen turned to Bunjee. "Please, Bunjee, Daddy thought that you were a fierce animal coming to attack him. He knows better now, but please be friends." Bunjee hesitated a moment. Then he smiled, shook Mr. Winsborough's hand with his trunk and said, "Pleased to meet you." They brought Bunjee into the cave. He didn't like the fire very much, so he plugged himself comfortably onto the wall just near the entrance. Of course, sleep was forgotten now. The children and Mr. Winsborough bombarded Bunjee with questions. What had happened to him after he'd been parted from them on the river? And had he fallen over the edge of the waterfall? Had he met the burning jelly? Bunjee told them that he'd managed to avoid being sucked into the caverns by inflating his trunk and floating over the hole. He'd wondered about the sandy plain. He'd wandered about the sandy plain looking for eggs because he was terribly hungry, but he hadn't been able to find one pterodactyl's nest. And then he saw Mr. Winsborough outside the cave. He'd been terribly excited. He'd found Karen and Andy's father for them, but every time he tried to approach the cave, Mr. Winsborough had thrown stones at him. Mr. Winsborough shuffled his feet uncomfortably and looked embarrassed again. "But everything's okay now," said Bunjee. He nodded at Mr. Winsborough. "And we're all friends." "But Bunjee," said Andy, "haven't you had anything to eat since we saw you on the boat?" "Nope." "Nothing at all?" said Karen. "Nope." Mr. Winsborough rushed to the back of the cave and came back carrying an armful of fruit. "You poor old thing," he said. "Here, tuck into this." Bunjee looked down in horror at the fruit. "Ugh!" he spluttered. "He doesn't eat fruit, only eggs," said Karen. "I don't mean to be rude." Bunjee looked up at Mr. Winsborough apologetically. "I've got it," said Mr. Winsborough, suddenly snapping his fingers. "I came across some eggs at the back of the cave the other day." "Where?" asked the other three together. "Oh, it's the caves further up down along the hill," he said. "I'm afraid we'll never find it in the dark. Can you hang on till morning, Bunjee?" Bunjee nodded and licked his lips. "Roll on breakfast," he said. Once again they settled down to sleep, the three Winsboroughs around the fire and Bunjee on the wall. The fire crackled and sparked and cast weird dancing shadows on the craggy walls, and as the fire dwindled, the shadows seemed to tire and dance less energetically until they lay still. The dull red glow of the fire died slowly, but before it was gone, it was replaced by the soft growing light of the new morning. I'm going to pause in chapter 11 there because it's such a long one, so I'll carry on in a moment. Don't you just love what he says? Look at this. Can you see that? I'm not sure. I just love the way Bunjee speaks, don't you? Anyway, bye for now. See you soon. Thank you. Bye.